Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's webcast, we're talking about how you can automate all sorts of business tasks using Retool Workflows. They allow you to visually build out each step of your workflow, leveraging all the Retool resources, including databases, APIs, and more. To learn about that, I'm joined by Keenan Copenhaver, Technical Product Marketing Manager at Retool. Keenan, good to have you with us today.
Hey, James. Good morning. Good to be here with everybody.
So, can you tell us briefly about Retool? I know that many listeners are familiar with it, but for those users who aren't, how does Retool serve its customers?
Sure. So the way we talk about Retool and think about it is that we just enable people to build good software much more easily than spinning up a development environment and using kind of a full code solution that many people are used to. So that covers everything from where Retool started, which was kind of admin panels and internal dashboards, all the way through like things like workflows, which we're going to cover today, and even customer facing and partner facing external apps, which is a launch that we recently did. So that allows people to franchisees, for example, to get access to the corporation's like data for their specific franchise, or if a writing agency is trying to onboard a bunch of freelance writers to automate those sorts of those tasks as well. So we're a low code tool that allows people to get things up and running very quickly, but also allows for technical and non-technical folks on their team alike to be able to edit and use the software that their business needs to run.
Great. All right, so before we begin, we have just a bit of housekeeping to do. First of all, thank you everyone for attending today. We greatly appreciate it. We do want to hear from you, and we'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to send questions along using the Q&A section on your screen. You don't need to wait until the end. You can enter questions anytime during the presentation. Also, today's webinar is being recorded. We'll send you the recording in the next 24 hours. Okay, Keenan, please go ahead and start your presentation whenever you're ready.
Absolutely. So like I said, thanks to everybody for being here. We are going to do two separate examples of a couple automations here, which are, I think, pretty interesting. And hopefully you can see my screen. If you can see my tabs up here, you have a little bit of a hint as to what we're working with. So let's just jump right in. So the first thing we're going to build today is a relatively straightforward uptime monitor. So in a former life, I was a developer, and I still work on side projects from time to time. And one of the tasks that I need to automate a lot of the time is I just want something basic that can tell me, whether my website is up and running or not. Kind of send me some sort of notification if it's down, so I can look into what's going on there. So there are a ton of different like SaaS products that will do this for you off the shelf, but this is also something you can build inside of Retool Workflows, and we're going to look at how to do just that. So this is a kind of blank Retool Workflows canvas. If you've used Retool for the app builder side of things, this is a little bit different than what you're used to, but basically we have this canvas with these different blocks that we can drag and drop to create all of the different steps in our workflow. So everything starts with a start trigger, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but basically this is just the starting block that lets you specify like how your workflow gets kicked off in the first place. So we support, using a webhook. So if you want to call it from a tool like Slack or something else, you can do that. We do support, running workflows on a schedule. So if you want to run it like a cron job every hour or something, every 24 hours, all that behavior is defined in here. So while we're building and testing this, we're just going to use this manual kind of run button up here. But this is where everything starts. So the first thing we need to do is add a new block. We're going to add a code block, right, to do the actual checking of our website and whether it's up. So when you create a code block, Workflows supports either JavaScript or Python. We're going to use Python for this example. And we're also going to adopt a little bit of a cooking show model here today, because I do have a lot of this code kind of pre-generated for us, so you don't have to sit here and watch me type everything. So the first thing we need to do is put together a relatively basic Python snippet that basically uses a library called requests and makes a call to ping a specific website and returns the status code. So all we really are concerned about with this relatively basic monitor is whether the website is returning kind of the default 200 status code, which means that the website's working properly and returning a response, or whether it's returning something like a 404, in which case that probably means there's something we need to look into. So this script here, just does that simple ping for us. And the one thing I do want to note is we are using the requests library here, which doesn't ship out of the box inside of Retool Workflows. However, if you pop open this library tab here, you can add, if you're writing JavaScript, you can add JavaScript libraries or modify the package JSON directly. You can also add Python libraries or modify the requirements TXT directly. And so that's what we've done. You can see we've added requests here And if we search for requests, you can see that it's enabled and ready to use, which is great because that means we can use it here. And for anyone not familiar with the request library in Python, it just provides a really nice sort of interface to do the sorts of things that we're trying to do here in terms of pinging a website. So in addition to being able to run our entire workflow end to end, each of the blocks that we create here also has a run button on it. So you can see we can just hit run and it returns us the 200 status code, which means that our URL here, the Retool homepage, is up and running. If, for example, we just put a random sort of URL string here and try and test that, you will see that we get a 404, which means this page is obviously one that doesn't exist on the Retool site, and so it returns our 404. So at first glance, this seems to be working pretty well. However, we don't necessarily want someone to have to come in here, run this manually, see if it fails, exist entirely within this interface, right? We all use other work tools that Retool can integrate pretty seamlessly with. So we're going to take a look at how to pipe this information into Slack, whether it returns a 200 or a 404. We just want to notify people in Slack kind of what's going on with this workflow. So to do that, we can head over to resources, which is basically a Retool concept for any sort of integration that you want to build. We will create a new resource, and we'll say we want to do Slack. We'll call this Uptime Monitor Reporting. And if you want to kind of change the scopes that Slack has and the permissions that Retool has inside of your Slack team, you can absolutely do that here. For right now, I'll just leave it as the default, and then I will go through the actual OAuth process of connecting it to Slack. And you can see that all it took was a few clicks. And as someone who's set up that integration manually more than a couple times before, I definitely prefer this approach. And you can see that now we have Slack connected. So we have a Slack resource called Uptime Monitor Reporting. If we go over here and we refresh, we will now be able to, just like we were able to create a code block, we can create a resource query for our Uptime Monitor Reporting Slack. And so we can just say report to Slack. And then just like any other workflow block, we can configure this one as well. So we can say we want to post a message. And if we tab over here to Slack, you can see that I have this workflows ping channel already created. And it's a public channel, which means our Slack integration should be able to post to it. So if we go here and we say workflows ping, then for our text, this is like the actual text of our message. So we'll just say uptime ping happened, right? And then we can just say status code. And this is one of the things I really like about Retool is the global state of any of your different workflow blocks is always available using this double curly brace syntax. So we can just do double curly brace, and we can say, because we named our workflow block ping website, we can just say ping website.data. And then that takes whatever the ping website block returned and implements that in any of our other blocks, which is really nice. So if we go over here, you can see this is 200 now. And if we hover over this, you can see a preview of our string, which tells us, our uptime ping happened and our status code is 200. So let's just save this. And now let's try running our workflow end to end, right? So we can trigger it manually using the run button up here. It will run our Python snippet, which will ping retool.com, and then it should post our status code into Slack. So let's see if that works as expected. And you can see here another thing that's useful about Retool Workflows is you have your entire run history down here. So you can see some of the runs that I was trying earlier this morning. We can go back and dive into those, see all the different blocks that ran, all that sort of stuff. And you can even see each individual block, what happened, if there were any errors. So there's a ton of audit controls here and basically ways that you can debug what's going on. Luckily for us, it doesn't look like there's anything to debug. It seems like everything ran correctly. And if we pop over to Slack, we see that, hey, our uptime ping happened and our status code was 200. So for example, we can run this again if we insert our random broken URL and we run it again. We should see that in this case, we expect to get a 404, which we do right there as well. So this is pretty useful as is, but there's a couple kind of improvements I can think off the bat to make to this. Number one, usually, especially if you're running this every couple minutes or something, a constant message in Slack that says like everything's okay is going to get kind of annoying and causes people to get alert fatigue when they're constantly like getting notifications for that channel or pinging over there and causes you to potentially miss errors that are happening. So one thing that we will do is we'll say that we only want to report a problem to Slack if it's actually a problem, right? So if it returns a status code other than 200, which means there's something going wrong with the website, right? Either a redirect was implemented or the page has gone missing or the server's down or some sort of other error. That's when we want to report to Slack. So we can do that relatively straightforwardly by breaking our connection between these blocks. For now, we will go over here and we'll insert a branch. So if you're familiar with straight up code, this is basically an if statement, right? So you can say if, again, we'll use our double curly braces here. Actually, we don't need to because we're using this in a block directly. So we'll say if ping website.data, right, does not equal 200. Then we want to do something, right? So this is where now we get a connection straight from this if statement to our Slack block. So now this is where the visual nature of this comes in handy. You can see it's going to ping the website. It's going to run into this if branch, and only if ping website data does not equal 200, which means there's something wrong with the website. That's the only reason Slack is going to trigger, right? So you can add as many sort of else if or else conditions here, just like you would if you were writing code of any kind. But for us, we just want to use our one simple condition, say, hey, we only want to report to Slack when there's an error. So with that in mind, we can kind of modify our message here, and we can just say something is wrong with the website, and then have it report the status code. So we can test this and say, okay, if we have our nonsense URL here and we run this, we should be able to see in Slack, yep, something is wrong with the website, status code 404. And if we fix our URL to be the correct Retool homepage and we run it, we shouldn't get any sort of output in Slack, because now that we have our if block in place, we don't see anything that works correctly. We just don't get any sort of notification about that. So this can just be constantly running in the background and basically only report on an error if there's actually a problem, which is pretty helpful. Another thing that would be helpful is if we could actually see the URL that is the error inside of our Slack message, right? Right now, we just have that URL hard-coded here, and that makes it a little bit opaque, not super accessible to other workflow blocks and things. It also makes it so that if you were triggering this from some sort of outside tool, say, for example, if you wanted someone to be able to call an API endpoint for this and pass in a URL that they wanted to check themselves, right now, the way we have this set up, you can't actually do that. What we can do, however, is use these test JSON parameters over here in our start trigger to specify the URL that we want, right? So in this case, we'll just say, hey, this is the URL homepage. And what's cool about this is now that if you expose this workflow as a webhook, or basically let people call this as an API, or if you call it from inside a Retool app itself, you can pass this URL parameter and make it whatever you want, right? And so for our testing, we'll just use retool.com. But now, since this is a parameter rather than being hard-coded, you can make it whatever you want, depending on how you want to call this workflow. So what we'll do is we'll go down here, and now we need to take instead of our hard-coded URL, we want to make this our start trigger .data.url. So now this is referencing the URL in our JSON parameters. We can go ahead and clean up this URL line since we don't need that anymore. And we'll just double check by running this one block that it's running correctly, and it appears to be running correctly. So the other thing we can do now that this is a parameter is, instead of saying something is wrong with the website, we can go over here and say, great, we actually want this to be our start trigger.data.url, so that we can have it say, hey, something is wrong with, and then the actual URL, which makes it a lot easier to see that, like, when we input a nonsense URL here and we run this, once we get that notification in Slack, it will say, hey, something's wrong with retool.com, etc. And then we can obviously click on this and say, oh yeah, this is a page that's 404ing, so we need to go fix that. So you can see like there's a ton of different directions you could go with this and make it, much more complex. Another kind of use case that I have frequently built with a full code solution that you could spin up with this relatively easily is to check for, the presence of a certain piece of text on the page and say, hey, we want to make sure that our homepage H1, hasn't changed, or we want a notification when somebody kind of changes that main marketing message. You could either do that, here within your ping block, or you could introduce a separate block that would do that sort of thing. So, we've only introduced 3 blocks here, but already, something that would have taken me maybe an hour or so to build in code, especially with all these integrations and the kind of custom logic and exposing it via an API endpoint, et cetera. We've done in, just a couple minutes. So I do want to mention that there's a couple different ways that, we can, now that we've clicked this big blue deploy button up here, there's a couple different ways we can actually let people use this, right? So in the triggers tab over here, you can see we have 2 kind of main options. Number 1 is this webhook trigger. And basically, like we mentioned before, this exposes, this API endpoint so that anybody can make a request to this if they have the, correct API key. Anyone can make a request to this API endpoint, and it will run the workflow and give them the response back. In this case, we don't actually have any sort of response here, but if we wanted to make sure that someone calling this as an API got proper response back, we could do that with our webhook return block and just say something like response uptime check has run, check Slack for the results. And again, if we were running this as a webhook, we'd probably, take out this Slack block and just let people, get the response information directly here. But that's one way that you can set up these workflows to trigger. And this is also useful if you want to call, a Retool workflow from either a Retool app or, in response to a Retool form submission. There are a couple different ways you can do that. If you don't want to do webhooks and you really just want to use this as a replacement for like a cron job, for example, instead, you can do that as well. So we have this schedule trigger, and basically, you can say, hey, when do we want to run this? If you're familiar with cron syntax and you want to use your cron syntax here, you can do that. But also you can say, hey, we want to run this, on Chicago time or Central time, right? Pick a time zone, and then, how often you want to run it. So every day at midnight, right? It just checks our homepage, and, then this will run in the background. And, maybe if something happens with the website, I'll wake up one morning and, I'll see a ping in Slack. But we now have, a functioning uptime monitor that we can trigger, kind of any way we want, which I think is pretty cool. So that is an uptime monitor workflow. If you're, working in IT or on a DevOps team or anything like that, hopefully this has spurred some ideas into your brain for some of those kinds of things you can automate. But we also want to take a look at a little bit of a different process. So I am on the marketing team at Retool, like James mentioned, and a lot of times what I am kind of trying to automate is taking, some sort of data, right, whether it's a call with a customer or just like some conversation in Slack, and using that as like an inspiration for an article, like a first draft of something that we're writing, either a marketing piece or something that goes on the blog or things like that. And it turns out that a lot of this new AI technology that's coming out with large language models and things like that are really good at that sort of thing. So what we're going to do is take a look over here at kind of generating an article writing pipeline with multiple steps, right? Tools like ChatGPT and Claude are great, and they can accept really complex prompts. But a lot of the times what you want to do is actually, have a chain of more simple prompts, each with a really specific focus, so that, you can take it one step at a time. And the interfaces that ChatGPT and Claude and tools like that expose don't necessarily make that super easy. Like you're having a lot of like back and forth, like, okay, have it do this step and then wait for the response and have it do this step. And it's a little bit hard to automate that process. But that's where a workflow engine like Retool can be really useful, right? So in this workflow, we are going to have it write an article for us. And I don't think I mentioned, but I am from Chicago. I'm also an airplane nerd. And in Chicago here, we used to have an airport that was right on the lake. And, due to a bunch of political things, like it got bulldozed and is now no longer there. But I have always, been convinced that we should bring it back and rebuild it. And so in this example, basically, we're going to develop a pipeline that's going to help me write this persuasive article that we should, recreate this airport on the lakefront in Chicago. So you can see here we have our start trigger, and we basically, put that premise for an article in as our prompt, in our test parameters, right? So now we need to actually start creating our workflow. So we looked at code, we've looked at resource query, but we haven't looked at any of these AI blocks here. So let's do one of those. We're going to do an AI action. And Retool has a bunch of pre-built actions for you, depending on what you're trying to do. So we have a bunch of image ones here. You can do a chat, which is pretty useful with our chat component inside of Retool's app builder. But what we're going to do here is generate text, because that's really what we want to do. And so we are going to call this generate outline. And again, a little bit of the cooking show mentality here. I've already pre-written a couple of these prompts because these are much longer even than the code. But you can see we're asking it to generate an outline for an article with the following main point, and then we're referencing the prompt that we passed it over here from our start trigger. We're using some kind of prompt engineering hackery and telling it to think step by step. We're asking it to do some brainstorming, and then we're asking it for some pretty structured output. So we're saying, hey, the outline should be included inside of these outline tags, and the thesis statement that you develop should be included inside of these statement tags. So we'll see why that's useful a little bit later. But for now, we're going to go ahead and set the model to Claude Sonnet. I really like that for any sort of writing tasks. But any model that you have configured as a resource, you can use inside of these workflows, including all the ones from Amazon Bedrock. We also support Azure and Google's models as well. So you can set these up as resources, just like we set up Slack as a resource, and put your API keys in there for whichever model you like to use. So we'll use Claude Sonnet for now, and we'll just give this a quick test to make sure it's working how we want it to be. So it's going to look at our very simple one sentence prompt. It's going to run through this block and generate us, some brainstorming. Perfect. It generated a statement here, and then it generated us an outline as well, which is pretty cool. So this is where the step-by-step kind of modality of Retool Workflows comes in handy. So you could just copy this response, paste it into another LLM like you would do if you were using ChatGPT for this. But what we can actually do is use code here and use the fact that we have our structured response to get a lot more specific with what data we get out of here. So we're just going to do a block here called get outline. And we're going to just use the fact that our outline itself is in our tags. And so we're going to do, for any programmers out there, we're just going to do a regular expression that basically just says grab all of the stuff that's between our outline tags and return it for us, right? So hopefully this should get us a clean version of the outline without any of the AI's brainstorming, which was helpful for generating the outline, but not super helpful for what we're going to do to actually have it write the piece. And you can see here that we have just the outline, which is great. We're also, for our prompt to actually write the article, going to want to get its thesis statement, right? Because that's kind of an important crux of the article. And so we'll go here and we'll just do kind of a similar thing, right? You can see here, we're just grabbing anything within the statement tags. So that should do something similar and get us just the thesis statement, which it does. And you can see the one that it wrote was a lot more detailed than the one that I initially prompted it with. So we've got now an outline and a thesis statement, and you can see, you can just line these blocks up if you want to make it a little more visually together. And so now we have kind of the working basis of what we need to put together an article. So in this case, we can chain another AI action block, right? And actually, because we need both of these inputs in here, we'll chain those both together there. We're still going to have it generate text. But instead, we're going to use a much more detailed prompt here. And I did want to call out that I did not write this prompt from scratch. You'll see it's much more detailed. But actually, Claude itself has a tool that will allow you to get these super detailed prompts. It will help you actually generate better prompts for your AI tooling. So in this case, we have a prompt that says you're tasked with generating a fully written article. First, let's review the thesis statement. And again, we're pulling in our thesis statement here from our block where we've gotten just the statement. And then we're asking it to pull in our outline. And then it says, okay, here's all the steps we're going to go through to generate the article. It's going to tell you about how it's going to write a conclusion. And we can scroll down here in this preview just to make sure that it's pulling in our data from the other blocks correctly, which it seems like it is. You can see our outline here. And so now we have all this set up. Once again, we're going to swap this over to Claude. And another thing I want to mention is that we do have a feature in Retool that's launched to some folks and was shipping to everybody else soon that lets you pick a default model when you're doing a bunch of this AI stuff. So if you're using the same model over and over, to not have to like swap this menu around all the time, you can set a default, which is helpful. So let's just see how we do here, right? So we let it run for a bit, and because this is a relatively long prompt, it's probably going to take a minute to run. But eventually, once it does run, we should see that we get, at least the beginnings here of an article. All right, so it says here's the fully written article based on the provided thesis statement and outline. Cool. So it even helpfully included it inside of article tags for us, which is going to be useful later. And you can see that it's it's formatted it using Markdown, but it does have a lot of different points here that it's gone through, as well as a conclusion. So that seems like that's pretty good for now. But one of the things that I've noticed in my own writing is that my first draft of something is never the best version. So we're going to add another workflow block actually here, and we're going to say, hey, great, now that we've written this, right? Can we edit it the same way, right? So we're going to have a similar prompt that just says, you are an expert editor, and you're able to like look at this original text. And this is where you as a person who had a unique writing style would insert kind of your conventions here, right? So for me, it's like when anything I write, I want it to have a conversational tone. Make sure we use active voice, right? So you could get pretty specific with these sorts of instructions. And basically it says, hey, yeah, return us the edited copy of the article as well as explanation, right? And so we can run this as well, and that will give us the output of final article. And so while that's running, we're going to just have a very similar code block up here to actually, extract the output of our final article, because it's going to include a bunch of explanation as to what it was editing as well. And we don't necessarily need that. So just like we extracted the outline in the thesis statement, we're going to extract kind of the article content here. Yep, so we can see here it's generated an article. It has our edited text, and it has the full length of the article here. And then, if we were curious, it has some explanation. So it's focused on enhancing clarity. It broke up some long paragraphs. It added some transition phrases, took out some jargon. So all in all, this seems like a pretty good edit. And so what we can do here is just say, okay, great. We want to extract just the article content. And then we have that here. So if we zoom out just a bit, right, you can see that we've basically, we've got a couple different AI steps, but one of the most powerful things for me about this sort of workflow is that it combines the non-deterministicness of AI with the ability to be super deterministic with code. And so we've basically taken some AI, filtered it through a bit of code, and what it gives us is, an article, which is, again, formatted in Markdown. So we can just take this and go over to something like Google Docs. And if we paste from Markdown, we can see that, we have an article here. So just kind of skimming through, like, it looks like some of these sections are relatively short. There's a lot of headings for, what amount of text is in here, in my opinion. So it would definitely be worth kind of going and tweaking the prompts. But, we do get an introduction, like a brief explanation about what it was, kind of the controversy around how it closed. And, then it gets into more of our persuasive argument about, hey, this is why we should rebuild it, some challenges and how it could be modernized. But, I would not hit publish on this right away. But as far as, solving the sort of blank page problem and getting something on the page to work with, this is a really great start. And again, because this is all a workflow now, you could have generated this same sort of article using ChatGPT or Claude or Google's Gemini just by using the chat interface and copy pasting your responses back and forth and engaging with it. But because this is a workflow, again, we could run this with a completely separate prompt. And and it would generate something similar. It would do all of these steps completely automatically, as opposed to we had to run them one at a time just while we were testing. But this is fully built out and is now kind of an automated pipeline for folks on your team to use. And so that's one of the benefits of a tool like this is you can have a process that you are really good at doing, encode that essentially in a set of workflow steps, and then make that process accessible to the rest of your team as well. Cool. So those were kind of the two demos that I wanted to go through with you all today. So I hope we have some questions. We have some time for questions if folks are curious or want to dig into either one of those demos in more detail or things like that.
Yeah, great presentation, Keenan. A lot of interesting stuff. We do have some questions based on your presentation. Question number one: can I schedule workflows to run at specific intervals or times?
Sure. Yeah. So like we looked at in the Uptime Monitor demo, the kind of scheduling piece of Retool Workflows is something that we find a lot of folks using, especially if you have cron jobs that you already have set up on your team, and they're kind of just running on someone's laptop or running on some server somewhere that there's not a ton of visibility for folks to see when they're running, how they're running, or even make changes to them. That information gets kind of siloed, and so we see Retool Workflows as a replacement for those sorts of cron jobs a lot, because you can either use the cron syntax if you already have it, or set up the interval scheduling to say, hey, every day at midnight we want to run this sort of thing.
Makes sense. Here's another question: how do workflows interact with Retool apps?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so, like I mentioned, basically you can trigger Retool Workflows from a Retool app as a resource. So just like you would make a database call in Retool to get information out of a database, you can also, for example, make a button click, like trigger a workflow to run, and then display that run's output in the Retool app interface. So workflows, we think of them as more of like a backend process. There's not a ton of like user-facing interface on top of them, whereas Retool apps there really is. And so you can absolutely like hook those together to get the backend processes of Retool Workflows with the actual like UI and things you can get in the Retool app.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question about time. What is the maximum execution time of workflows?
So the maximum execution time, I believe the query, like each individual block has a max runtime of 10 minutes, I believe. And then the workflow as a whole can execute over the course of a day. So even like long running processes and things, you can use these sorts of things for.
Here's a question from Arvind. Can we publish the workflows as a library for example, a ping website exposed to a function that can be used by someone else?
You absolutely can. You can, again, like we mentioned with the webhooks piece on the left there, it was, you have kind of the URL that you can give to anybody. You as the Retool account owner are, restricted and build on like the amount of workflow runs that you have in your account. So you can absolutely like use these in other pieces of software and things that you build, but you'd want to like make sure that you are pricing those things accordingly, and so you're not paying for a bunch of workflow runs for folks that aren't paying you for those in return. So
can you version control workflows?
Absolutely. So, both Retool apps and Retool Workflows, we want to make them work for developers and using developers' workflows. And so here I can actually share this. But if you go up to this 3 dots tab up here, you can click on this button that says Protect Workflow. And basically, this is, okay, your workflow is going to be checked into source control. All of your changes are reviewed and merged using pull requests. And it's also protected from being deleted. So Retool does have a concept of source control, which lets you use kind of a more traditional software development workflow to make changes to your Retool apps if you don't want people to be able to kind of use this visual interface to change things. Along with that, you get access to things like staging environments and other tools that you would expect to be able to access in a more traditional software development workflow. And that just locks it down a bit and makes it so that you have a bit more control over that.
Looks like this is the last audience question. Is it possible to create conditional branches or loops within a workflow?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we looked at branching a little bit, but you can also create loops so that you can say, hey, like we want to, rerun this sort of action like 10 or 15 times, or we want to rerun this action until a certain condition is met, that sort of thing. And so really, if you think about kind of the main programming language paradigms, like, branching, loops, like function calling, those sorts of things, we've tried to map all of those paradigms into things that you can do inside of Retool Workflows as well. So that it's very easy to take, back-end scripts and things that are running and bring those into the platform and make them more accessible to folks on the team.
Actually, we got two last questions from Alex. He says, nice presentation and answers. How would you describe your ideal user? I mean, obviously, exhibited functionality goes beyond the low-code approach and citizen devs audience.
Sure. I think, the workflows product in particular, like we mentioned, we get a lot of folks who are, they would identify themselves as like backend developers, and they have a lot of these, things that they're being asked to automate for their team, but it still requires like somebody on their team to file a ticket and then them to like actually kick off the script because it's just some random Python script sitting on their computer or something. So we do get a lot of that. I do think, we do get a lot of like Retool, what you're referring to as citizen developers as well. Because a lot of the concepts are like cross-functional with Retool apps, and so we get a lot of folks who maybe like know how to write SQL, and as soon as they can see, oh, we can have a workflow step that connects to a database, and like I can write SQL in here, and maybe wouldn't consider themselves like a full-on developer, but they do know how to write SQL. They feel very comfortable in our platform for that reason. And really, there's a lot of folks too that do know how to write, Python scripts or little snippets of JavaScript or whatever, or can, use AI tools to help them write that sort of code. But where they would get stuck is the whole, okay, now once this is working, like how do I get this deployed? How do I give other people access to it? How do I make this into something that our other pieces of software can use? And that's another thing that you get with the Retool platform is that like you get that API URL right away, like it's already living in the cloud or in your self-hosted instance if you're self-hosting Retool. And so a lot of the steps from like I have a working thing, now I need to productionize it, which is where a lot of people get stuck, especially those folks that aren't super well versed in like server provisioning and all of the DevOps things. Really find a good fit there because they can focus on just the logic that their thing needs to work and let us take care of all the rest of the stuff that they need.
Mm-hmm. Katan asks, is it possible to start the workflow from a failed step or a specific step?
Yeah, good question. So we are working on some kind of retry logic at the moment. But what you can do is, like we mentioned, you can kind of kick off the workflow from a specific block, and we do have some logic to rerun kind of previous parts of the workflow as well. So let's see, what you can do here is, but for example, if we're back here in our uptime monitor on these three dots, you can see, okay, run with previous blocks, and so that will kind of run it from anything up into that block. You can also, have things like error handlers so that basically error functionality is either reported to you or logged out somewhere so that you can jump in and debug that. But the sort of retry logic and all of that is definitely something that's coming because that's been a pretty popular request from folks to say, hey, it worked up to this point. We don't want to redo all the work we've already done, but we want to kind of see if we can fix the error in this block and move forward. So yeah, stay tuned for sure.
Arvind has an additional question. He asks, what is the pricing model as Monitor will run somewhere in the cloud?
Sure. So for the latest kind of up-to-date information on this, retool.com/pricing is where you want to go. We do have this kind of like table up here that shows you, like on our free plan, for example, you get 500 workflow runs a month. And again, as long as those workflows kind of exist within the limitations of the timeouts and stuff that we talked earlier, that's completely available to you on the free plan. And as you go up, obviously you can see you just get like more workflow runs and that sort of stuff. And so there's that summary up there, but you can also kind of scroll down here and see we have this whole workflow section that really goes into detail about that. So yeah, lots more information here, retool.com/pricing.
Great. Keenan, I think you've answered all the questions. I guess I would also want to know, where should people go for more information if they want to find out more?
Great. Yeah. We have a dedicated page on our site for workflows. So retool.com/workflows. That page will hopefully someone in the near future be getting a little bit of an adjustment to allow you to kind of experiment with this workflow concept, even when you're not, inside of your Retool account. So be on the lookout for that. But definitely, if you're interested in learning more, retool.com/products/workflows is the place to go.
Fantastic. Keenan, thank you so much today for the presentation, and thank you to our audience. So we greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl.